Joining me in studio is Aaron Klain. He is the Mideast Bureau Chief and Senior Investigative Reporter with Breitbart. Also with us, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer, a retired Marine Corps intelligence officer and currently the president of KIP, a strategic risk management firm. Hal, I'd like to start with you. We have the IDF now indicating that it was a single Hamas terror cell that carried out these two drive-by shootings in the West Bank this week. Hamas praising the murderers as heroes and martyrs. So what does this mean for the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas on the Gaza Strip?
Michelle, it does not bode well. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already made it very clear that the Hamas has basically claimed credit. And he says, how can we have a credible ceasefire in the Gaza Strip with Hamas if they're going to be doing terrorist actions like this in the West Bank and elsewhere? So basically, this could lead to an unraveling of that ceasefire, which took a long time to put in place.
Aaron, hundreds of Israelis think that whatever action is coming from the government, it just simply isn't enough as they're seeing loved ones die. But what can Israel do? How should Israel respond to this?
I think that we have to look at the larger scheme of things and what's going on both in Gaza over the last few months and then just in the last week in the Golan Heights, where Israel is very clearly trying to ensure that its own civilians are safe from the threat of the tunneling. So suddenly, when Israel in the north is trying to dismantle the Hezbollah terror tunnels, and Hezbollah, of course, backed by Iran, suddenly you have this spate of attacks in the West Bank. So the question needs to be, are they linked? Is this maybe Iran telling Hamas, which of course takes money and sometimes direction from the Iranians, to light up the West Bank? So Bibi has to be very careful. How many battalions can he deploy in the West Bank versus having to be constantly on high alert right now, especially in the north?
Hal, does this make sense? I mean, we've discussed this prospect of a multi-front war, that this could be Iran's plan to drag Israel into this. So does Israel taking action against Hamas just plays into Hamas's hands, both in the fact that it's then distributed, or the military is focused on a number of fronts, but it's also then dragging Israel into a war, which then creates more hate amongst the Palestinian people and creates more international condemnation, because the international community only starts to pay attention to something when Israel goes and takes some action. So it seems like Israel is stuck between a rock and a hard place here.
Well, it is. And that is classic insurgency warfare, if you will. We talk about this in fourth-generation warfare. You can go back to the writings of Mao Zedong and Lenin when they talk about terrorism, or what we call terrorism today, being a series of actions to provoke their enemy, if you will, to do things that will discredit them in the eyes of the people. In this case, there's a series of actions which is basically Israel has no choice but to crack down with basically military, operational, and many times kinetic means in order to put some sort of security fabric on top of what's going on. However, in the long run, that's not really sustainable forever. In the long run, you really have to go in there and do those things where you're winning hearts and minds, if you will. You're creating a vision, an end state, an incentive for Palestinians in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip to cooperate, participate with Israeli government policies to create some sort of more stable peace environment with the idea that it's going to lead to economic prosperity and betterment across the board. So that's kind of where they're going.
Yeah, I mean, it's a cycle that has to end, and we'll continue this conversation on the other side of this break. So Aaron and Hal, stick around. I'm here discussing the recent string of deadly attacks in the West Bank. My guests are Aaron Klain from Breitbart and retired Marine Corps intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer. Gentlemen, thanks for being back with us. Aaron, Prime Minister Netanyahu is threatening to take some tough measures against this, including demolishing the terrorist homes, which is what is done to counter the incentive, the financial incentive that the Palestinians give to the terrorists for their murderous acts. Another point that he made today is that he's going to expand into West Bank settlements, that he wants to build more in response to this, to not give them a victory. What do you make of that?
The question is whether he means to build new settlements or he's talking about expanding existing settlements. And I'm pretty sure he's talking about expanding existing settlements. And I think that sends a message to Fatah and to the Palestinian terror apparatus that they have nothing to gain here from continuing these attacks. And by the way, it's happening at the same time the Palestinian Authority is essentially not talking to the White House about their peace proposal. I mean, Israel has made clear, we saw it in Gaza, and in the past in other peace proposals, that Israel is willing to take very difficult decisions in a peace deal.
Right.
But there needs to be some response, both militarily and politically.
Where are we in terms of Palestinian leadership? We have Hamas praising this. We've got Fatah unofficially calling these people martyrs and celebrating their attacks, whilst you have Abbas officially on paper condemning the attacks, but putting the blame on Israel. I mean, where do we stand in terms of who do you even talk to?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, also, you have two separate Palestinian entities. You have Gaza, you have the West Bank. Abbas, Fatah, the Fatah organization, is calling for an escalation. They're paying the families of terrorists. They're not talking to the United States. But more than that, what are the Palestinian security forces doing to clamp down on this Hamas terror cell? I mean, a lot of this is taking place, according to the IDF, in Ramallah. That's a Fatah, Palestinian Authority stronghold. And it looks like they're not really cooperating so well with the Israeli authorities in trying to find the cells. And so at the very least, you would think they would help to stop terror from their own cities.
Right, and that's just part of the issue, is that there's been a disintegration with relations between the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Americans, essentially not even having any contact with the Trump administration. But there is some progress in terms of this act that the U.S. House has passed, legislation targeting those responsible for human shields, the use of human shields. And they're saying that there will be consequences. Now the president is likely to sign this act. But what does it mean once this legislation is signed, that those responsible for using human shields will be targeted?
Yeah, I mean, anyway, we're talking about Palestinian terror groups that should be targeted regardless. And you look at, by the way, the tunneling in the north, and you see that actually Hezbollah used civilian homes, as they usually do, in order to begin the tunneling. In other words, the Hezbollah guerrillas would go into civilian homes, snake under the Lebanese border, including the United Nations, and get into Israel and carry out very likely mass terrorist attacks. So clearly, the terror groups have to be held responsible.
Hal, we're talking about these raids that the Israeli forces are conducting. They're going into settlements, they're going into areas, rather, where the Palestinians are embedding themselves amongst the civilians. The Israelis are trying to minimize civilian casualties, whilst Hamas is using them as human shields. How does this work from a military perspective? Give us a little bit of insight into the dynamics involved in going in and conducting these kind of raids as have been happening overnight.
Well, it's a very tough targeting solution, if you will. You have to go in there. You have to take you have some very strict rules of force or rules of engagement in terms of when you can shoot, not shoot, how you would enter property. You have to be very careful that you don't do things that are so over the top that your security is such that when you go in there, you alienate everybody in that neighborhood, so to speak. So you have to be, it's a real tough balancing game. But the other part is that when they go in there, there's a series of thresholds, if you will, on the intelligence that they have to make sure that they really do know who they're going after. The other thing, too, though, is also working with the Palestinian Authority, but also working with basically local Palestinians in the area and building up the lines of communication, if you will, the human intelligence capability, because you can only get so much through technical means. Well,
unfortunately, we know what the Palestinian leadership does to any Palestinians that collaborates with Israel in any way, shape, or form. They kill them. We've seen that. So that's another complicating factor here. Hal, thank you so much. Hal Kempfer, Aaron Klein, both of you, thank you for being with us, and we appreciate your analysis.